Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
Late autumn pressed into the frontier town with a steady chill that had settled weeks ago and never lifted. A thin layer of dust slid across the main road whenever the wind kicked up, brushing against storefronts with cracked windows and faded signs. People moved quickly between buildings to stay ahead of the cold, their coats pulled tight and their hats lowered to shield their faces. Horses tied outside the saloon shifted in place, lifting their hooves restlessly as if feeling the same unease that hung over the street. Naya stepped into this space with slow, uncertain movements, trying to stay close to the edges of the road where fewer eyes would fall on her. Her breath came out thin and shaky, not from the cold alone, but from the exhaustion in her bones. Her deerskin clothing, decorated once with bright beads and tassels, hung torn and uneven. Several beads were missing, threads snapped, and the skirt was frayed from traveling through brush, dirt, and unfriendly towns. Her arms, bruised and scraped, stayed tucked close to her body as if she expected someone to reach for her at any moment. Her mind kept circling the same thought: just pass through. Do not stop. Do not look at anyone. The last town she entered left her chased out with curses thrown at her back. She hoped this place would be different, though she had no real reason to expect kindness. She made it several steps before a young boy near the blacksmith shop noticed her. His eyes widened, and he pointed at her with a mix of curiosity and fear. "Pa, look," he shouted. Naya froze. The sound tightened something deep in her chest. She didn't turn toward him, but she felt the shift of attention as people nearby followed the boy's stare. Her legs felt unsteady. She forced herself to keep moving, head lowered. "Hey, you!" an older man barked. The harsh tone struck her like a physical blow. She stopped again, breath catching. Her hands twitched, unsure of where to go or what to do. She tried stepping back, but the livery's wall was behind her. Within seconds, two more men approached. Their expressions tightened when they saw her clearly. Her clothing, her skin, the fear she couldn't hide. "What's she doing here?" one muttered. "She's trouble," another said, louder. Naya lifted her hands slightly, palms open, a silent attempt to show she meant no harm. Her heart pounded in her chest. She had learned not to run. Running made people angrier. Standing still sometimes kept them from escalating. But today it didn't help. A voice from behind the group muttered, "Monster!" Another echoed it. The word cut through her, sharp and familiar. Her stomach turned. She had heard it in other towns, heard it whispered by frightened settlers who didn't care what she had lost before they called her dangerous. The first stone came suddenly. It struck her leg with a dull, heavy impact, and she staggered, gasping. She steadied herself with one hand against the wall. Pain flared through her calf, but she bit it back, not wanting to show weakness. Showing weakness often made things worse. A second stone hit her shoulder, pushing her sideways. The crowd grew louder, fueled by each other's fear and anger. Naya lifted both arms to shield her face. Her breath shook. She tried to look for a path out, a narrow space where she could slip through, but their bodies blocked every direction. Her thoughts scrambled. Stay standing. Don't fall. If you fall, they won't stop. Another stone flew past her ear, close enough for her to feel the air shift. Someone shouted for her to get out of town. Someone else told them to finish what they started. Her chest tightened, and her vision blurred at the edges. She felt trapped, cornered, unable to speak a single word that might calm them because she knew it wouldn't matter. Her voice had never changed anything before. A new sound cut through the noise, steady footsteps on packed dirt. The crowd hesitated, parting slightly as a quiet figure stepped through. Cole Harrow walked with slow, measured strides, his dark coat swaying faintly with each step. His hat cast a shadow across his brow, but his expression was clear, tired, wary, carrying the weight of someone who had seen too many bad decisions made by desperate people. He had been on his way home from a supply run, planning to reach his cabin before the light faded. He didn't want trouble. He avoided trouble whenever he could. But when he saw the woman pressed against the livery wall, her arms raised, her body shaking from pain and fear, something inside him tightened. He didn't know her. He didn't know what she had done or what had brought her here. All he saw was a person being hurt while she stood defenseless. The memory of times he had stood by and regretted it later pulled at him in a way he could not ignore. He walked straight into the circle. No shouting, no threat, just the kind of presence that made men step back on instinct alone. "That's enough," Cole said, his voice low but firm. The tone alone broke the rhythm of the crowd. Several men lowered their stones. A few muttered but backed away. Cole didn't look at them. He stepped between Naya and the next person who might have thrown something, positioning himself so she was fully behind him. Naya's breath caught again, but this time from disbelief. She didn't understand why he stood there. No one had done that for her before. Her legs trembled harder. She swayed slightly. Cole glanced back at her, seeing the exhaustion, the pain, the panic that held her frozen. His jaw tightened. He didn't want to involve himself further, but leaving her here meant something would happen he didn't want to witness. He crouched and lifted her into his arms, careful not to force her injuries. She gasped softly, surprised by the gentleness. Her instinct told her to pull away, but she couldn't. Her body lacked the strength, and his hold was steady, not rough, not threatening. The crowd watched, confused and unsettled. Cole began walking away, carrying her without another word. When someone called after him, "You can't just take her." He didn't turn around. He kept walking until the shouts faded behind them, until the last building fell away and only open land stretched ahead. Each step took them farther from the pain she had grown used to, though she didn't allow herself to believe she was safe. Not yet. Her thoughts churned. Why is he helping me? Where is he taking me? What does he want? But exhaustion pulled her deeper into his arms, and the steady rhythm of his walk kept her from falling apart. Cole didn't look down at her again. He just kept his pace, jaw set, mind turning over the choice he had made. He didn't know if it was wise. He didn't know what would come next. He only knew he couldn't leave her there, and that decision would change both of their lives for good. The sun had nearly disappeared by the time Cole reached the edge of his land. The cold deepened quickly in the open fields, the kind that crept through clothing and numbed hands if a person stood still too long. His cabin came into view as a small, sturdy shape against the fading light, smoke rising from the chimney in a thin, uneven line. He kept one arm firm beneath Naya's legs and the other braced around her shoulders, adjusting his hold whenever her breathing changed or her weight shifted. She tried once to speak, a faint sound in her throat, but fear tightened her voice before any words formed. Cole didn't press her. He only lifted her a little higher and continued forward, boots crunching softly over the packed dirt path that wound up to his front steps. When he reached the porch, he pushed the door open with his shoulder, letting the warm air spill out. The stove inside had kept burning from the morning, its soft red glow spreading through the small single-room space. He stepped in and eased the door shut behind him, careful not to let the latch snap loudly. Naya's eyes moved around the cabin with quick, frightened glances. The room was simple. One bed near the back wall, a small table with 2 chairs, tools hung neatly near the door, shelves stacked with folded blankets, jars, and repair tools. Everything looked used but cared for. No clutter, no sign of anyone else living there. Just him. Cole lowered her onto the bed with slow, measured movements. The moment her back touched the blanket, she tensed, arms instinctively drawn toward her chest. She didn't push him away, but she didn't relax either. Her breath came shallow and fast. Her mind raced through possibilities. Is he going to lock the door? Is she trapped? Did she just trade one danger for another? Cole stepped back immediately, a full pace, then another. He didn't touch her again. He didn't even reach for the blanket beside her. He kept his hands visible and his posture open, shoulders lowered, showing he meant no harm. He had seen fear like this before, in horses after long chases, in wounded men after battle. Fear that came not from a single moment, but from days or years of running. "You're hurt," he said quietly. "You need rest." The words were plain, without demand. Naya's gaze flicked to the door. It wasn't locked. That eased her tension by a fraction, though her fingers stayed tight where they clutched the blanket. Cole moved to the stove, choosing each motion with care, so he wouldn't startle her. He lifted the lid slightly, checked the embers, and added a small piece of wood. The new flame brightened the room, casting a warm glow on the walls. He reached for the kettle, filled it from the water bucket, and set it on the stove without letting the metal clatter. Every movement had a gentleness that felt deliberate. When he knelt to reach a clean cloth from the shelf, her breath hitched. He froze for a moment, just long enough to show he had heard her, and slowly stood back up before bringing the cloth near her. But he didn't touch her. He set the cloth and a bowl of water on the small table beside the bed, within reach but not forced upon her. She watched every step he took, trying to understand him. He had stopped the crowd. He had carried her gently. Now he kept distance. Her thoughts trembled between suspicion and the first small flicker of relief. Cole hung his coat on the hook by the door, rubbing the cold from his hands before kneeling near his supplies. He placed a few canned goods on the table, then filled a pot with broth from a jar he had prepared days earlier. The scent rose quickly, warm, simple, welcoming. He stirred it slowly, his face lit by the stove's glow, his expression calm but focused. He rarely looked in her direction, sensing how easily she flinched under direct attention. When the broth warmed, he poured a small amount into a tin cup and set it on the table close to her, but not so close that she felt cornered. "Eat if you can," he said, voice steady. She didn't move at first. Hunger gnawed at her, but fear pressed harder. She waited until he stepped away, until his boots sounded near the opposite wall, where he began organizing his supplies, giving her space. Only then did she reach out slowly, her fingers trembling as they closed around the cup. The warmth surprised her. It steadied her breath enough for her to take a small sip. Her throat burned slightly from dryness, but the taste eased something deep in her chest. Cole noticed, though he didn't turn fully. That small sound, a quiet swallow, told him she was at least willing to trust the food. When she finished half the cup, she lowered it carefully. Her hands loosened a little, the tension in her shoulders lowering by one small degree. Cole took a blanket from the shelf and brought it closer, stopping again when her eyes widened. He lowered the blanket onto the bed without touching her, then stepped back to the other side of the cabin. "You take the bed," he said simply. "I'll stay by the stove." His tone carried no negotiation, no suggestion of an exchange. It was a fact, spoken as plainly as stating the temperature outside. Naya watched as he lay down near the stove, still wearing his boots, using his rolled-up coat as a pillow. He didn't face her. He didn't make a sound beyond the quiet settling of his body on the wooden floor. He was exhausted from the day, but he didn't let sleep take him yet. He listened to her breathing, to the shift of blankets, to the small sounds that would tell him if she was afraid or trying to escape. Not because he wanted control, but because he wanted to be aware if she needed something or if danger came near. Naya lay stiff on the bed for a long time, eyes fixed on the beams of the ceiling. She expected him to get up, to change his mind, to move closer. But he didn't. He stayed on the floor near the stove, one arm over his chest, eyes closed, but his posture calm. The distance he kept confused her. She had met men who gave kindness only to demand something later. She didn't know what he wanted, but the longer she watched him, the more her heartbeat slowed. His breathing remained steady. His body didn't shift toward her. If anything, he seemed to be trying to make himself as unthreatening as a large, tired man could be. For the first time in days, the fear pressing against her ribs eased enough for her to shut her eyes. Outside, the wind brushed against the cabin walls. Inside, the stove kept the air warm. And two strangers, one terrified, one worn down by life, lay in the same small room, separated by several feet of wooden floor and by every past wound they both carried, yet held together by the simple fact that neither had turned away. Morning came slowly, with a thin gray light filtering through the small window above the table. The cabin felt still, almost suspended, the warmth from the stove holding the night's cold at bay. Naya opened her eyes before she moved, the way a person did when they weren't certain of their surroundings. For a few seconds she didn't breathe at all, her thoughts snapping back to the last place she remembered, the street, the stones, the crowd. But then she heard the faint scrape of wood outside, a steady rhythm, slow and deliberate. The sound grounded her. She turned her head slightly and saw the empty floor where Cole had slept. The blanket he used was folded neatly, already put away. Nothing in the cabin was disturbed. Nothing had changed while she slept. She eased herself up on her elbows. The blanket he'd left for her was still over her legs, warm from her body heat. She looked around again. Everything was exactly as it had been. Tools arranged carefully on the wall, boots by the door, the stove glowing quietly, the table empty except for the tin cup she hadn't finished. Her body hurt from the bruises and from days of walking, but the pain felt duller this morning. Her stomach tightened with hunger, but she hesitated before reaching for anything. This wasn't her home. She didn't know the rules here. Outside, Cole split wood with the kind of steady strength that came from years of repetitive work rather than force. His axe rose and fell in a slow rhythm. Not rushed, not aggressive. Just purposeful. She listened for a while, letting the sound tell her that he was not inside watching her, that she had space to figure out her next move. Eventually, hunger pushed her to rise. She slipped off the bed carefully and tested her balance. Her legs shook at first. She steadied herself by pressing her palm lightly against the wall. She crossed the room in small steps and reached the stove. The pot still held a little broth, now cold but edible. She lifted the lid, checked it, then set it back quietly. She found a cup on the shelf and poured a small amount, aware she should not take more than necessary. The broth tasted different cold, but warmed her stomach nonetheless. She held the cup with both hands, her fingers stiff from tension. The door opened. She stiffened instantly, cup trembling slightly. Cole stepped inside with an armful of wood, his boots leaving faint dirt prints on the floorboards. Cold air followed him, filling the cabin briefly before he shut the door with a slow, controlled motion. He paused when he saw her standing. Not an alarm, just taking the scene. Her posture, her hands, the cup, the distance she kept between them. "You're up," he said quietly. His voice was deep from the cold, steady, without any sharp edge. She nodded once. Words still felt unsafe. Cole moved to set the wood near the stove. He didn't come close to her. He kept several feet of space between them, placing each log down in a neat stack before straightening. He brushed the dirt from his gloves and looked toward the window, not directly at her. "You can take what you need to eat," he said. "There's more in the cupboard." Her eyes followed his gesture. The cupboard stood open enough that she could see canned vegetables and a few jars. She hesitated before nodding again. The idea of taking anything from him, even with permission, made her uneasy. But hunger had a stronger voice. Cole stepped to the window and adjusted the latch that had loosened overnight. He worked quietly, with the same precision she had seen yesterday. Every movement had intention. He didn't waste steps. He didn't fidget. He seemed like a man who had learned to conserve everything: food, tools, words. While he worked, she cleaned the cup she used, wiping it carefully with a cloth and placing it back exactly where she found it. The gesture came from habit. She had survived many places by not leaving traces or inconveniencing anyone. Cole noticed but didn't comment. Instead, he crouched to check the stove's ash pan, then stood again, dusting off his hands. Only then did he speak, keeping his tone low. "You can rest today. No one will come out this far." His words were meant to reassure, but she still checked the door again, her shoulders tight. She didn't believe safety could last more than a few hours. Cole stepped toward the stool near the table, intending to sit, but stopped when he saw her inch backward automatically. He changed direction without a word and sat on the chair furthest from her instead. That small adjustment caught her off guard. He moved differently than the men she feared. He watched her reactions, not with judgment, but out of caution for her, not himself. She lifted the cup again, her hands more stable now. She drank slowly. Minutes passed in quiet, filled only by the soft crackling inside the stove and the faint whistle of wind outside. Neither spoke. They didn't need to, but something shifted in the silence. It wasn't the thick fear from last night. It was a quieter space, where neither intruded and neither was forced to retreat too far. Cole finally broke the quiet, his voice steady. "If you're strong enough later, I'll show you where the water is kept." He didn't say it as a command. It was closer to a courtesy, letting her choose how close or far to stand from him. She nodded again, her thoughts circling around one new realization. He isn't forcing anything. She didn't know what that meant yet. She didn't know what he wanted. But for the first time since she had fled her burned settlement weeks ago, someone spoke to her without anger, without suspicion, without seeking something in return. She set the cup down carefully. Cole didn't look up, but his jaw softened slightly, as if he understood that the smallest actions could mean the most. For now, they share the same space. Quietly, wary but not hostile, separate but not alone. And that was enough to begin a fragile, wordless trust neither of them had expected. The afternoon settled cold and bright over the open land as Cole stepped outside with his coat buttoned high and an empty sack slung over his shoulder. The sky held a pale, steady light, the kind that made the dry grass look washed out and brittle. He planned to check the traps along the creek bed before the sun dipped too low. Animals moved slower in the cold, and he needed whatever he could catch to stretch his supplies through the coming weeks. He didn't expect Naya to follow, but when he reached the edge of the porch and turned slightly to adjust his gloves, he saw her standing just inside the doorway, one hand braced on the frame. Her head was angled down, eyes watching him from beneath her dark hair. She didn't speak. She only waited, uncertain, ready to retreat if he refused her presence. Cole exhaled slowly and gave a single nod toward the yard. Not an invitation, not a command, just a signal that she wouldn't be unwelcome if she came along. She stepped out carefully, closing the door behind her without turning her back to him. Her movements were deliberate, cautious, shaped by weeks of watching every direction at once. Cole noticed the way she kept her hands close to her ribs, checking the tree lean every few seconds. He recognized that kind of vigilance. He'd lived with it himself for years. The ground crunched under their boots as they made their way toward the creek. The wind brushed through the dry reeds with a low rustle, and the horizon stretched without sound. Naya walked a few steps behind him, keeping enough distance to feel safe, but not far enough to lose sight of him. Every so often, she glanced at his back, trying to gauge whether his intentions had changed since morning. They reached the first trap near a fallen log. Cole crouched beside it, his fingers moving with practiced steadiness as he inspected the mechanism and reset the hinge. A small rabbit lay caught, still and limp. Naya's breath hitched lightly at the sight, but she stepped closer. Her curiosity pushed through her fear. Cole didn't touch the rabbit right away. He gave her a moment to look, to understand what he was doing. She leaned down slowly, studying the way he checked the trap's alignment. Her eyes lingered on the rabbit's fur, then on his hands, rough, steady, scarred in places. "It's for food," he said quietly, sensing her question before she voiced it. "Nothing wasted." Naya nodded once. She understood well. Survival meant using what you found, even when it hurt to look at it. At the next trap, Cole showed her the trigger mechanism, lifting it with the edge of his glove. "If you check these alone," he said with a slight tilt of his head, "don't reach in fast. Animals panic when caught. They bite." The way he said it mattered. He wasn't telling her what to do. He was trying to keep her safe. She watched him closely, memorizing his movements. Her face softened for the first time that day, not relaxed, but no longer pulled so tightly by fear. They returned to the cabin slowly, Naya staying nearer to him than before. The cold sharpened around them, and Cole could hear her breathing grow heavier. She was still weak. When they reached the porch, she steadied herself on the railing, her fingers gripping the wood until the dizziness passed. "You all right?" Cole asked, keeping his distance but watching her closely. She hesitated, then nodded, though her legs trembled. He didn't call out the lie. He simply opened the door and stepped aside so she could enter first. Inside, the warmth wrapped around them, thick and steady. Naya exhaled, her shoulders lowering as she crossed to the stove. She didn't sit. Instead, she looked around for something she could do, anything that didn't make her feel like a burden. Her gaze landed on the broom leaning near the wall. Her fingers twitched, unsure if she was allowed to touch it. Cole noticed. "You can," he said quietly. She reached for the broom with slow hands and began sweeping the cabin floor. She worked carefully, gathering fallen bits of wood, dirt from his boots, and dried leaves tracked in from outside. The motion helped her steady herself. It was something she understood, a routine, a purpose, a way to settle in a place without taking up space. Cole repaired a stool leg while she worked. He sat on the floor with his tools beside him, sandpaper smoothing the edges, nails set neatly in a row. The sound of the broom brushing the wood mixed with the soft scrape of his work. For a long time, neither of them spoke, yet the cabin felt different, less like a place holding two strangers and more like a space where their movements could coexist. At one point, Naya hesitated before sweeping near his boots. She paused, unsure if entering his space would bother him. Cole noticed the hesitation and shifted slightly to the side. Not far, just enough to give her room. That single gesture told her more about him than any words had so far. When she finished, she leaned the broom back in its place. Her breath was steadier now. Her hands no longer shook as violently. Cole rose and wiped his palms on his trousers before stepping to the stove. He ladled warm broth into a tin bowl and set it gently on the table. Naya watched him, waiting for what he would say next. "For you," he said simply. It wasn't an order. It wasn't charity. It was acknowledgement. She approached slowly, sat at the edge of the chair, and ate with careful bites. Cole turned away, giving her privacy while he placed the rabbit from the trap on a board to prepare it for later. She glanced at him once, brief, cautious, but different than before. There was no accusation in her eyes, just observation, just measuring him in a new way. When she finished eating, she noticed his tools arranged on the floor. Without thinking too long, she filled a cup of water and set it beside his hammer and cloth, placing it there quietly. Cole looked at the cup, then at her. His eyes softened, not wide, not emotional, just a small shift that carried weight. "Thank you," he said. She lowered her gaze quickly, but a faint warmth rose in her chest. Not safety yet, not trust, but something close enough to build toward. For the first time since she entered his home, the silence didn't feel like a wall. It felt like a space they shared. The wind shifted in the late afternoon, carrying a change in the air that Cole recognized before he saw anything. It was the kind of stillness that came when riders approach from a distance, too faint for the ear at first, but clear enough for someone who'd spent most of his life far from town noise. He stepped onto the porch with his coat half-buttoned, eyes narrowing toward the tree line. Naya stood inside the cabin, sweeping near the stove. She felt the shift too, not from sound but from instinct. Her shoulders lifted slightly, her spine straightened, and her hands stopped mid-motion. She turned her head toward the door, her breath shallow. Cole didn't look back at her yet. He focused on the horizon where two shapes slowly emerged. Men on horseback, moving at a controlled pace. Not rushed, not lost, searching. He stepped fully outside and closed the cabin door behind him, leaving only a narrow sliver of light spilling onto the porch. He didn't latch it, but he didn't leave it wide open either. A small signal that she could see out if she needed, and he could reach her quickly if danger pressed through. Cole descended the two porch steps with deliberate, even strides. The riders slowed when they spotted him, their horses snorting clouds of warm breath into the cold air. The first man was tall with a stiff posture, his coat buttoned to his chin and his expression carved into a permanent scowl. The second was younger, but carried the same narrowed eyes, a look that said he enjoyed authority, even when it wasn't his to hold. "Evening," the tall one said, lifting his chin in a way that wasn't quite polite. "Cold day for walking around." Cole didn't respond to the comment. He stood still, boots planted firmly. "Something you need?" The younger man leaned slightly forward in his saddle. "We're looking for someone. Town says she ran out this way." Cole didn't blink. "Who?" "A woman. Apache." The man's tone hardened on the last word. "Dangerous. Stole from the mercantile. Try to start trouble." Naya, inside the cabin, pressed a hand to her chest. She stood behind the door, barely daring to breathe. She knew the accusations weren't new. People blamed her for anything they didn't want to understand. She stepped back from a small crack of light and kept her gaze fixed on the blurred shapes outside. Cole kept his voice calm. Haven't seen anyone. The tall man shifted in his saddle. She's small but strong, wearing deerskin. Might be injured. His eyes scanned Cole's yard with slow intention. It's important we find her. Cole's jaw flexed once, an almost invisible movement. Why? We just told you. The younger one snapped. She's a threat. You know how they are. Cole's expression didn't change, but his silence deepened in a way that made the air feel colder. The riders exchanged a quick glance. They expected him to agree, or to look afraid, or to offer information they didn't yet ask for. Instead, they saw nothing in his face except the calm, steady stare of a man who made decisions he didn't explain. You sure you haven't had any visitors? The tall one asked, leaning forward a little. Tracks lead this way. Tracks lead everywhere, Cole said. Wind's been shifting all morning. The younger rider huffed a frustrated breath and wiped his glove across his face. If you see her, you come to town. Sheriff wants her gone before she causes real harm. Cole didn't acknowledge the instruction. He just stood there, steady and unmovable, until the tall man nudged his horse and turned toward the road. The younger one followed, though he lingered long enough to take one last look at Cole's cabin, narrow-eyed, suspicious. Cole waited until their silhouettes shrank into the distance before he stepped onto the porch again. His breath fogged lightly as the cold settled back around him. Only then did he open the cabin door. Inside, Naya stood near the table, her hands trembling slightly. She had backed away from the door when she heard the horses leave, but her pulse still pounded in her throat. They'll come again, she whispered. Cole closed the door behind him and removed his gloves, setting them on the table. He watched her carefully, not with worry, but with awareness. Maybe. Her voice tightened. They want me dead. He didn't deny it. He didn't soften it. Instead, he leaned his hands on the back of the chair and met her eyes directly for the first time that day. You're safe here. Her breath faltered. Safe was not a word she trusted. Not yet. She stared at him, searching for any angle that suggested he wanted something in return, any sign of hidden intent. But Cole's face showed nothing except a tired steadiness. No hunger, no expectation. Just a simple statement spoken as if it were a fact as certain as the cold outside. Her voice broke slightly as she asked, "Why help me?" The question hung in the warm air between them. Cole lowered himself into the chair, exhaling slowly as he rested his forearms on his knees. He looked down first, not to avoid her question, but to choose the right words. He finally lifted his gaze, calm and steady. Because no one else did. Naya swallowed hard. A pressure filled her chest. Not fear, not relief, but something caught between them. She sank slowly onto the stool beside the table, her hands clasped tightly. Cole didn't reach for her. He didn't step closer. He just sat there, letting the silence settle naturally. He knew she didn't trust easily. He knew trust wasn't something that could be forced. Outside, the wind brushed against the cabin walls with a low, steady sound. Inside, two people who had known too much pain sat in the glow of a single stove, bound not by words, but by the quiet understanding that neither had turned away when the world pushed hard against them. The days after the riders came past with a slow, steady rhythm that neither Cole nor Naya spoke about. The tension from that afternoon lingered at the edges of the cabin, but it softened each time they worked around one another without conflict, without raised voices, without sudden movements meant to intimidate. Little by little, the air grew easier to breathe. The mornings were colder now. Frost clung to the window edges, and each breath rose faintly in the chill before the stove warmed the room. Cole always rose before dawn. Naya learned his footsteps by sound. The quiet way he moved across the floor, the steady scrape of wood being added to the stove, the careful closing of the door as he stepped outside to start chores. She woke earlier each day, no longer startled by the unfamiliar surroundings. At first, she pretended to sleep when he approached, but eventually she allowed herself to sit up when the first light touched the window. She wrapped the blanket around her shoulders and watched him prepare the morning fire, his posture relaxed but purposeful. He didn't speak until she did, and she didn't speak until her fear loosened enough to allow a few small words. By the sixth day, the shift was noticeable. That evening, The cabin smelled faintly of cooked rabbit and herbs. A low flame glowed inside the stove, casting warm, flickering light across the walls. Cole sat on the wooden stool near the stove, a needle and thread in his hands, repairing the tear in his work glove. His fingers were thick and rough, but he worked with slow precision, looping the thread steadily through the leather. Naya stood across the room for a long time, watching him. Her expression was unreadable at first, but her eyes stayed fixed on the glove, then on his hands, then on his face. Something had been building in her for days, a sense of safety that didn't come from his words, but from the consistency of his actions. Finally, she stepped closer. The floorboards creaked softly under her feet, and Cole lifted his eyes. He didn't speak, but he set the glove down and waited, sensing she had something in mind. She took a breath, nervous but determined, and held out his coat, the one with the torn seam on the shoulder that he hadn't gotten to yet. Her hands trembled slightly as she extended it. Cole blinked once, surprised. He accepted the coat gently, his fingers brushing hers for only a second. She didn't pull away this time. Her breath tightened, but she held her ground. "You want to mend it?" he asked quietly. Her nod was small but certain. He reached for the needle again and handed it to her. When her hand closed around it, he saw the uncertainty in her eyes. Not fear of him, but fear of doing something wrong in his home. He shifted on the stool. "Sit," he said, nodding toward the second stool. She hesitated, always hesitant, but then she obeyed, lowering herself beside him. Not across the room, not behind him, beside him. It was the closest she had willingly been to him since the night he carried her away from the crowd. Naya threaded the needle with careful fingers. Her hands weren't steady at first, but they found their rhythm as she focused. She brought the needle to the tear and began stitching slowly. The coat rested across her lap, and she leaned forward with quiet concentration. Cole watched her work, not staring but observing. The stove's glow reflected off her dark hair, showing the strands she had brushed earlier until they lay smooth. The beads woven into her braid clicked softly as she moved. "You've done this before," he said. She kept her eyes on the stitching. "Yes." Her voice was very quiet, but steady. Cole nodded once, accepting her answer. No questions, no prying. She felt the respect in that simple response. As she worked, the silence between them felt different, no longer heavy or thick with caution. It was calm, steady, a silence that held room for both of them. She finished the seam and ran her fingers gently over the repaired fabric. When she handed the coat back, Cole inspected the stitch work with a slow, thoughtful look. "It's good," he said. She looked at him, unsure if he meant it or if he was trying to comfort her. But Cole wasn't a man who used unnecessary words. She knew that now. His tone held sincerity, and she allowed herself a small, almost invisible exhale of relief. Cole hung the coat on the wall peg, then returned to the table. He cut a few vegetables with a slow, steady rhythm, preparing supper. Naya moved beside him, quietly picking up the pieces he'd finished and placing them into the bowl. At one point, she brushed against him by accident, her shoulder touching his arm lightly. She stiffened, expecting some reaction. Cole simply stepped a little to the side to give her more room, neither pulling away in discomfort nor drawing closer in expectation. She studied him briefly, noticing the gentleness in that small adjustment. Not rejection, not demand, just awareness. Later, when the food simmered over the stove, Naya settled on the edge of the bed while Cole sat near the window. She watched him remove his boots, moving slowly because the cold always made his injured leg tighter. He rubbed his knee once, a faint wince crossing his features. For the first time, she asked a question. "Your leg. It hurts." Cole paused. Her voice, quiet, careful, carried genuine concern. He nodded once. "Cold makes it worse." She looked at him a moment longer, then lowered her eyes. She didn't push for details. He didn't offer any. They both understood the boundaries of silence. When the storm outside rose into a soft howl against the cabin walls, Naya stepped closer, drawn by instinct more than thought. She moved to stand near the stove, her hands resting on the edge of the table. Cole joined her after a moment, not too close, but close enough that she felt the warmth of his presence. For the first time since she arrived, she didn't feel the need to keep several steps between them. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe he wouldn't turn on her without warning. Their connection grew not through words, but through the steady, quiet choices they made. To sit near each other, to mend each other's belongings, to prepare food side by side, to share a room without bracing for danger. And as the wind pressed against the cabin and the stove crackled in the dim light, Naya realized she no longer felt like a stranger hiding in a man's home. She felt like someone who was allowed to stay. And Cole, glancing at her from the corner of his eye, realized he didn't mind the company. Not anymore. The storm rolled in just after sundown, bringing a sharp drop in temperature that pressed against the cabin walls in steady, unbroken gusts. The sky outside had turned almost black except for the faint silver glow of the moon behind clouds. Snowflakes drifted sideways across the small window, tapping against the glass with a soft insistence that reminded Naya how far the cabin was from any road, any town, any danger, or so she hoped. Inside, the stove burned brighter than usual, fed twice to push back the night's cold. The warm light flickered over the wooden floor, stretching shadows toward the corners of the room. The air smelled of cooked vegetables and rabbit broth, the last remnants of supper now cooling on the table. Naya stood near the stove, her hands hovering above the heat as she tried to chase the chill from her fingers. She watched Cole move around the cabin. Slow steps, methodical checks, quiet movements meant to ensure everything was secured for the storm. He fastened the shutter latches, then crossed to the window and pushed a folded cloth into a small crack to stop the draft. His face tightened slightly as he leaned on his bad leg, the stiffness returning now that the temperature had fallen even lower. She saw it, and, for the first time, she allowed herself to look openly at the discomfort he usually hid. When he turned from the window, he caught her watching. Their eyes met for a second too long, and she lowered her gaze out of habit. But something inside her urged her to look up again, if only to confirm he hadn't taken her stare as a challenge or offense. He hadn't. His expression remained calm, steady as always. Cole removed his coat and hung it on the peg. The room felt smaller without the wind howling through the cracks. The quiet settled heavy but warm, not suffocating. Naya found herself moving closer, not enough for their bodies to touch, but close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from him as he crouched to check the fire again. She hesitated. Her breath shook once as she gathered herself. Then she spoke his name. Cole. The word left her softly, unforced, carrying uncertainty but not fear. It was the first time she had said it aloud, the first time she tried to address him not as a threat, not as a rescuer she didn't understand, but as the man he was. Cole paused in the middle of adjusting the stove lid. He turned his head slightly, not abruptly, giving her space to change her mind if she regretted speaking. His eyes lifted to hers with patient attention. Yeah, he said quietly. Naya swallowed. Every muscle in her shoulders tightened before loosening again. She had rehearsed what she wanted to say in silence for hours. Phrases she wasn't sure he would understand. Fear she wasn't ready to reveal. Yet what came out was simpler. You do not want me to leave? Her voice cracked slightly, not from pain, but from the strain of asking something so vulnerable. She kept her hands clasped together, fingers interlocking tightly, as if holding herself steady. Cole straightened slowly and took a step toward her, not too close, but close enough that she didn't have to raise her voice. His face remained calm, but there was something gentler in his eyes than before, something she hadn't allowed herself to see. No, he said, I don't. He didn't try to soften his answer with explanations. He didn't look away or hide the truth. He simply said it, clear and honest. The simple finality of it hit her harder than she expected. Her breath trembled as she looked down, letting the words settle into a part of her mind that had been locked shut for weeks. People had pushed her away, hunted her, treated her like something dangerous to get rid of. She had forgotten what it felt like to be wanted anywhere. She lifted her eyes again. Then, I stay. This time her voice didn't shake. It was quiet but certain, her choice, not desperation. Cole's breath left him slowly, a long exhale that sounded almost relieved. He nodded once, a firm, steady gesture that matched her certainty. "You stay," he repeated. A long moment passed between them, silent, stable, unbroken. Not a stare, not an invitation, just a shared understanding that the line between guest and intruder had shifted into something neither of them had expected when she first crossed his doorstep. The storm outside crashed harder against the walls, the wind bending branches and scattering snow, but inside the cabin the air felt warm and still. Naya stepped closer to the stove, but her eyes stayed on Cole. He noticed her nearness and moved a fraction, not away from her, but to give her a comfortable space beside him. She understood the gesture instantly. It wasn't rejection. It wasn't fear. It was respect, and it allowed her to stand at his side without the usual coil of tension gripping her spine. She watched as he removed his boots for the night, slow and careful because of his injured leg. She hesitated again, then spoke in a quieter tone. "Your leg, it hurts more tonight?" He looked up, surprised she had noticed, but he didn't deny it. "Storm makes it worse." She nodded, unsure what else to say, but Cole didn't expect anything more. Just her asking was enough. As the stove crackled, she stepped to the bed and lowered herself onto the edge, not retreating to the far corner like before. Cole moved to sit on the stool beside the stove. The distance between them had changed. They could feel it. Not tense, not fearful, just closer. For the first time since she arrived, the cabin didn't feel like his home with her inside it. It felt like a place they shared, even if neither had spoken a word about belonging. The wind roared outside, but inside, the steady glow of the stove held the room in warm, quiet safety. And Naya, lying down beneath the blanket, did not fall asleep in fear. She fell asleep knowing someone wanted her to stay. And Cole sat a while longer by the stove, listening to the storm and the soft, even sound of her breathing, feeling, for the first time in years, that the cabin no longer felt empty. The storm passed by morning, leaving a pale, washed-out sky above the land and a thin crust of frost over every patch of grass. Cole opened the door just enough to look out, letting in a brief rush of cold before shutting it again. The yard was quiet. No riders. No tracks except the ones he and Naya had made earlier in the week. He hung his coat by the door and turned toward the room. Naya was already awake and sitting on the edge of the bed, her hair loose from sleep, a few strands falling gently across her cheek. She wrapped the blanket around her shoulders, but her posture held none of the rigid fear from the first days. She watched him, waiting for some signal of how the day would unfold. Cole added wood to the stove, the flame rising with a slow crackle. "Cold morning," he said, not filling the silence with anything more. Naya nodded. Her voice remained quiet, but steadier than before. "I can warm the water." He paused for a second, surprised not by her offer, but by how naturally she said it. He stepped aside from the stove. "Go ahead." She moved with more confidence than she'd shown when she first arrived, not rushing, but no longer checking every corner before passing through. She took the kettle, filled it from the bucket, and set it gently on the stove. Her hands no longer shook with each action. When she reached for the ladle, she didn't look to him for permission. Cole watched her work, the morning light casting a soft line across her face. He didn't speak. He didn't want to disrupt the calm rhythm she had fallen into. When the water warmed, she poured some into a bowl and placed it by his tools at the table, exactly the same way she had set it days earlier. But this time, she lingered a little, brushing a few wood shavings from the surface of the table, as if she had done it 100 times. Cole stepped to her side to grab a tool from the shelf. She didn't move away like before. She simply shifted a little toward the window, giving him room without retreating. The proximity felt normal now, quietly understood, not forced. Throughout the day, their routines merged without either of them naming it. She prepared vegetables. He chopped wood. She swept the floor. He fixed a loose board at the entryway. She brushed dirt from his coat. He brought in extra firewood knowing she'd get cold. Their movements overlapped, creating a quiet choreography inside the small cabin. At midday, Naya stepped outside for a moment, pulling the blanket over her shoulders as she looked across the open field. The air was crisp, and the sky brightened enough for the sunlight to touch the frost like tiny shards of glass. She breathed in deeply, the cold burning her lungs in a way that felt strangely good. Cole stood on the porch, mending a rope. He glanced at her once, not checking on her, but acknowledging her presence. She saw the look and found herself stepping closer instead of staying distant. She stood beside the porch railing, hands resting on the wooden beam. "It's quiet," she murmured, more to herself than to him. "Yeah," he answered. "Quiet most days." She looked toward him, studying his face in the white morning light. "You like it that way?" Cole tied off a knot in the rope before answering. "I learned to live with it." Something in his voice was honest in a way she didn't expect. Not defensive, not guarded, just true. Her next words slipped out before she could stop them. "I do not fear here." He turned his head, meeting her eyes. A long pause stretched between them. Not uncomfortable, but weighted in a meaningful way neither of them knew how to describe. "You don't need to," he said softly. They didn't speak again for a while, but neither stepped away from the porch until the wind picked up and pushed them back inside. That evening, the cabin felt warmer than usual, not from the stove, but from the way they moved around each other with an ease that had grown day by day. When Cole finished cutting the vegetables, he set the knife down and turned toward the shelf to grab another pot. As he stepped behind Naya, she didn't stiffen. She didn't step back. Instead, she rested her hand on the table to steady herself, letting him pass so closely that his sleeve brushed her arm. She felt it clearly, and her breath stopped for half a second, but she didn't move away. Cole felt the contact too. He paused just long enough for her to know he'd noticed, then continued forward. No tension in his shoulders, no avoidance, no discomfort. It was a small moment, but it mattered. Later, after supper, Naya sat on the edge of the bed, brushing her hair with slow, deliberate strokes. Cole was near the stove, cleaning his tools. The distance between them was shorter now than it had ever been. The quiet no longer felt like something that pressed between them. It felt like something they both contributed to, an understanding shaped by respect rather than fear. Naya watched him briefly, her expression thoughtful. She lowered the brush and stood. Instead of retreating to the far side of the room, she stepped toward him, stopping at the table. Her fingers touched his coat lightly, just enough to smooth a wrinkle. She didn't look at him while she did it, but the gesture was deliberate. Cole turned slowly, the soft scrape of his chair against the floor the only sound. "Naya," he said quietly. She finally looked at him. He didn't reach for her. He didn't take a step. His voice carried everything the moment needed. "You're not a burden here." Her breath caught. For days she'd been waiting to hear something like that. Not in words, but in action. She had seen it in those actions, but hearing it made her chest tighten with something she hadn't felt in years. Permission to exist without apology. She lowered her head for a moment, overwhelmed in a quiet, private way. When she lifted it again, she stepped closer, just one step, but enough that the space between them felt undeniably shared. She sat beside him on the edge of the bed a few minutes later, not asking, not checking. She simply settled there, close enough that their shoulders were a hand's width apart. Cole didn't move away. He leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees, letting the silence settle again. This time warm, full, almost companion-like. And for the first time since their paths crossed, the thought surfaced in each of their minds without them saying it aloud. This is no longer two people trying to survive near each other. This is the beginning of building a life side by side. The last cold of the season settled over the land in a quiet, steady way, not with the violence of a storm, but with a calm that signaled winter's final grip before spring. The sky stretched pale and open above the fields, and thin wisps of frost clung to the fence posts lining Cole's property. Inside the cabin, the stove let out a low hum, warming the room with a comfort that had become familiar to both of them. Cole stepped outside at dawn, his breath rising in soft clouds as he checked the traps along the tree line. The cold bit at his leg, and he moved with the slow, deliberate care he always used on mornings like this. But his thoughts stayed on the cabin, on the woman inside who no longer kept her back to the walls, who no longer flinched at every sound, who had begun to share this life with him in a way neither of them had expected. When he returned, the yard was quiet, only the soft crunch of frost under his boots breaking the silence. He opened the cabin door, letting in a thin gust of cold air before shutting it again. Naya was sweeping the floor near the table, her movements steady and calm. Her hair was neatly braided, small beads catching the light as she turned. She wore one of his old shirts over her deerskin top to keep warm, the fabric hanging loosely around her shoulders. She looked up when he entered, and the expression on her face was no longer guarded, just attentive, grounded, familiar. "You're back," she said softly. "I am," Cole replied, setting the bucket down beside the stove. He removed his coat, shaking off bits of frost, and hung it on the peg. Naya set the broom aside and stepped closer, her eyes drifting briefly to his injured leg as he stretched it subtly to ease the stiffness. "It hurts today?" she asked. He nodded once. Cole does that. Something in her eyes warmed with quiet concern. She moved to the stove, lifting a small cloth she had warmed earlier. Without asking, without hesitation, she handed it to him. Cole accepted it, the warmth spreading through his palm. He didn't thank her aloud. He didn't need to. Their silence held a deeper understanding now. She stepped back, watching him with an expression that carried a certainty she hadn't shown before. It was the same certainty that had been building in her since the night she spoke his name without fear, growing stronger with every shared meal, every mended stitch, every moment he protected her without demanding anything in return. "I want to tell you something," she said quietly. Cole set the cloth aside, giving her his full attention. She steadied her breath, her fingers curling slightly at her sides. "I want to stay here," she said, "not because I have nowhere else, not because I must, because I choose." The words came out with remarkable clarity, her voice firm despite the emotion settling in her chest. It was the first time she had spoken about her future without fear of what he might say. For a moment, Cole didn't move. He just looked at her, the light from the stove flickering across his face, softening the lines earned from years of hard living. Something shifted in his expression, something quiet, steady, deeply sincere. "This is your home," he said, voice low but full. She took a slow breath. "And you want me here?" He stepped closer, closing half the distance between them. He didn't rush. He didn't reach for her yet. He let the truth settle into the space between them the way their trust had grown, gradually, respectfully, without force. "I do," he said simply. "I choose you too." The relief that washed over her was gentle, not overwhelming. It settled deep inside her, replacing the fear that had lived there for so long. Her eyes softened and her breath steadied. She stepped forward until only a hand's width remained between them. Cole didn't raise his arms immediately. He waited, always giving her room to move first, to decide the shape of her own safety. Naya lifted her hand slowly and touched his chest, just over his heartbeat. It was a quiet gesture, steady and sure. Cole lowered one hand to rest lightly at her waist, careful not to startle her. Their closeness felt natural now, earned, not taken. She leaned into him, her forehead touching his shoulder. He let out a slow breath, resting his hand gently along her back as he held her for the first time, without urgency or fear, just belonging. Outside, the frost began to melt under the first hints of spring sun. The air carried a softness that promised change. Inside the cabin, something settled and rooted itself in a way that neither Cole nor Naya needed words to explain. Their life from that day forward was shared, not by accident or necessity, but by choice. 2 cups on the table, 2 blankets by the bed, 2 sets of footsteps moving in rhythm inside a cabin that no longer belonged to one person alone. Naya stayed, Cole stayed, and together, they built a life grounded not in promises spoken aloud, but in actions, steady, gentle, constant. A home formed through the simple and final truth they had both chosen. They belonged to each other, and neither of them was alone anymore.